If I asked you to, you could move your fingers or control your breathing. And as I'm sure you're aware, your pupils can also move. But here's the real question. Can you consciously control them, like flexing a muscle, so you can widen or shrink them on command? Short answer, no. Most people can't directly move their pupils at will, but many people can learn indirect control through attention, arousal, or training, especially with biofeedback. And there are even rare individuals who seem to do it unusually well. So let's unpack what's actually going on. Your pupil is not a muscle. It's a hole in the iris. The iris has two muscle systems controlling that hole. The sphincter pupillae, which makes the pupil smaller, and the dilator pupillae, which makes it bigger. And here's the key. These muscles are controlled mostly by the autonomic nervous system, meaning not usually under voluntary control. So how does the pupillary light reflex work? There's actually two different types of reflexes. We have to differentiate between parasympathetic and sympathetic reflexes, referring to constriction and dilation. Let's start with the classic parasympathetic pupillary light reflex. The reflex begins when light enters the eye and causes stimulation of the optic nerve, which carries information about light from the retina. The optic nerve becomes the optic tract, and a subset of optic tract neurons project to the pretectal area in the brainstem, where they synapse on neurons that extend to nuclei called the Edinger-Westphal nuclei. There's one of these nuclei on each side of the brainstem, and these nuclei contain neurons that project through the oculomotor nerve to a structure called the ciliary ganglion. From there, the short ciliary nerves extend to the pupillary sphincter to constrict the pupil. In contrast, the pupillary dilation pathway is controlled by the sympathetic nervous system. Here, the first-order neurons originate in the hypothalamus. They descend uncrossed in the dorsolateral brainstem. This is where they reach the so-called ciliospinal region of Budge. This is also where the second-order neuron originates. These preganglionic fibers go to the superior cervical ganglion. From here, the postganglionic neurons enter the skull by ascending along the sympathetic plexus. Through the internal carotid artery and the nasociliary nerve, they enter the dilator pupil. So, if you're wondering, why can't I just decide to shrink my pupils? Because you'd be trying to consciously override midbrain and autonomic circuits that evolved to run automatically. However, there is a cheat code. And here's where it gets interesting. Pupil size is not only about light. It also tracks arousal, mental effort, attention, and surprise. A major player here is the locus ceruleus, or LC, a brainstem nucleus that releases norepinephrine widely across the brain. LC activity is strongly linked to pupil dilation in many contexts. So pupil size is often used as an indirect marker of LC-linked arousal. So, even if you can't command the iris, you can sometimes change the pupil size by changing your brain state through, for example, effort, stress, focus, emotion, or even imagery. This, again, leads to the question, can you train it? Here's what research says. With biofeedback, people can learn some control. Participants can learn volitional up and down regulation of pupil size. One high-profile study showed people could learn control over the pupil and that it's linked to activity in brainstem arousal systems. There's also follow-up work showing voluntary pupil modulation even under conditions like concurrent stimulation, suggesting it's not just a one-off lab trick. There's also a scientific report describing a single person who could change pupil size on command with fairly large constriction or dilation. The participant claimed not to use any other technique than feeling and activating the pupillary musculature directly. Specifically, he stated not to use the imagination of brightness or other stimulation, not to self-induce emotional activation or mental effort, or to change the way he breathes. So, what's the honest answer? Can you train to widen or shrink your pupils at will? If that means direct, precise, muscle-like control, then usually no. Through indirect control, however, for example through arousal or attention strategies, for many people it does work, especially with biofeedback. Extreme control without tools is very rare, but documented. So if you ever see someone controlling their pupils, it's likely they're altering autonomic balance through mental state rather than consciously moving the iris like a finger.